one view that comes up in the forums is the notion that social sin isn't really real in itself. And even if it's not put this way, this is kind of what's meant, because there's the view that social sin or communal sin is really just the collective, sort of, it's the accumulation of a whole bunch of bad individual choices, and whatever that is social sin, and there's nothing else. It's merely an accumulation of particles. I want to suggest that that's not right, and that's because we've got quite a bit. Well, at least I'm going to push back on it. We've got quite a bit of evidence for things called emergent properties, and emergent properties are everywhere. So, for example, if I were to show you this pen, and I can show you that this pen writes, it has the ability to create words. Okay, so this pen has a property called ability to create words on paper, something like that. However, if you were to look at the individual components of this pen, you would find that none of them have, quote, the ability to write on paper. So, for example, you can take this part off, and this part doesn't have the ability to write on paper, nor does the spring. This one does. This part does have the ability to write paper. I could but it's very flimsy. And notice that the pen as a whole is not flimsy. So this has a property, flimsiness, that the pen as a whole does not have. And you can start to go all the way down on this. You can go down to the molecular level, and once you get to atoms, right, none of the atoms have any of these properties, flimsiness or ability to write on paper, whatever. The point being that when individual component parts get together and they're formed into objects and things, they take on new properties, new things become true of them that are not true of their component parts. Similarly, we can see this in human activity, and one of the best examples is economics. If you look at say there's a big earthquake, right? And then the next morning, the people on the TV say that the markets have responded to the earthquake by devaluing futures in whatever. Okay. Notice that what's just happened is a collection of individual choices, right? The markets has now been given intention and reaction. It now has sort of a mind of its own. And the mind of its own is not merely something that can be described or attributed to any of the individual component parts. Many of the individual component parts, like the individual choices that people made, had nothing to do with any earthquake at all. Or they might have had to do with the earthquake, but in a way that the rational agent wasn't even aware of, right? So one rational agent who's sitting around deciding whether or not to buy or sell stocks might notice that on TV, just randomly out of the corner of his or her eye, sees some devastation, and this subconsciously impacts it. It gives them a negative feeling, right? And this negative feeling then translates into a desire to sell this stock or buy this stock. You can see how fabulously complicated this is, right? And this is done over millions and millions of people. And as a result, the aggregate of all of these totally unrelated, we're able to say something about markets as a whole. Markets have an emergent property. We can describe intentionality. We can describe responses that this aggregate being has. Markets demonstrate emergent properties that no individual member of the class of people that make up the markets individually has. And you can multiply the examples all over the place. But the bottom line is that when human beings get together, there's this really subtle, really complicated, really systemic interplay between individual choices, responses, intentions that bubble up. And over time, an institution takes on a quality or takes on properties. Properties emerge in an institution that are not reducible to individual agents in the institution or the system or the community. In economics, it's often called spontaneous order, right? So, for example, it's interesting that if you give a whole bunch of people freedom to make choices, it's interesting that in aggregate, you can talk about the United States of America, for example, as being a consumerist society. Well, is every individual in the United States a consumer? In some, I guess, respects, yes, but the intentionality that's attached to that is more than just saying, oh, 51% of Americans are consumerist. Rather, it's that over time, a kind of order develops that you can see in the whole that you can't see in the constituent parts. A snowflake. A snowflake is the result of fractal designs being multiplied across a large, interstices of molecules. At no point at the atomic level, the micro level, can you see the order or the pattern of the whole. But if you step back at the macro, you can say, that's beautiful. And what you're responding to, the beauty that you're responding to, is a structure or an order that the whole has that the parts don't. If you were to then look at like just some, 32% of that snowflake, you look at that and be like, that looks weird. That doesn't demonstrate symmetry, order. It's bizarre. It's a jagged piece of a snowflake. But the snowflake as a whole demonstrates symmetry, order. It's a spontaneous order. It's a spontaneous symmetry. It's something that emerges from the complex interactions of the constituent parts. But notice that it has a property that the constituent parts do not. Social sin is merely the application of this truth that's found across the created order to moral decisions, to moral attitudes, to sins and sinfulness that communities and societies and institutions have that individuals do not. And that is critical. Individuals do not. It's hard to make it's hard to give specific examples without getting too on point. But you might say that in some ways a person who grows up in the middle of, say, war-torn Rwanda, whose parents are violent people, whose neighbors are violent people, when that person becomes violent, it's difficult to say that that's just the result of a whole bunch of individual choices. Some of those things may not have been choices at all, because the person is embedded into a community that fosters these attitudes and beliefs. What's normal for this person is not normal for everybody else. What's sinful to this person is not what's sinful to everybody else. And so there's a structure to sin. There's a communal aspect to sin. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to go beyond that. But the danger in merely reducing sin to individual choices that are out of keeping with God's character or something like that is that once you go down that road, you have no way of addressing structural problems, and you have only a way of addressing individual choices. And we see time and again that that's not the only way to go about things. If you want to change people's behavior, you don't merely indicate, stop doing this. Instead, you also change the environment around which that choice is being made over and over again. When I do pastoral counseling, one thing that is really important is when you have, say for example, someone is involved in a self-destructive behavior. If every single time that I've done this in pastoral counseling, I've noticed or I've found that that person is engaged in a self-destructive behavior in the midst of a family or communal environment that enables, or even in some cases requires, that self-destructive behavior to continue. Now, I am not saying that people engaged in self-destructive behavior should not try to stop, but I'm also saying that we should address the system of which they are a part that encourages, or in some cases requires, self-destructive behavior to continue. I've heard it this way in some addiction counseling. Addiction counselors will say that you take out, you come to the fishbowl, right? And the fishbowl is dirty. It's gross. There's gunk everywhere, and you take the fish out of that fishbowl and you put them into rehab, right? And it's a beautiful, clean, monitored fish tank, and the water is pure and the food is good, and you get that fish whole and robust and healthy. And then what? You just put them back in a dirty tank? That makes no sense. Rather, while that fish is out of the bowl, you go to the environment. You clean that up too. Now, that's no guarantee that when the fish comes back that the same things aren't going to happen, but it sure is less likely that the things are going to happen. And that's because social sin, institutional sin, environmental sin is real. there are emergent properties that are not the properties of the individual constituent parts. The whole is more than the sum of its parts. And that's why we have to go beyond simply addressing individual behaviors and going to institutional, communal, and societal behaviors and environments if we're going to have a really robust, comprehensive, and I would say biblical notion of sin.